Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you at your conference, the 5th anniversary of Dad's Matters. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see what I can see. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about the myth-busting power of dad science. I've been studying fathers for the last 15 years, looking at the science and anthropology of fatherhood around the world. And I'm going to give you a bit of a summary today of that science with the hope that you can use it in your campaigning work and also use it to empower fathers as they step into that role of involved fatherhood. The first thing I want to say is that when I'm speaking about fathers, I'm not necessarily speaking about the biological father of a child. What's absolutely fascinating about studying fathers, particularly around the world, is that fathers come in lots of different shapes and sizes. And therefore, really, when I'm talking about dad, I'm actually talking about the person, or indeed persons, who step up and do the job of being an involved father. In some countries, that is the biological father, or it could be a stepfather, an adoptive father, but also it could be a social father. And a social father is someone who is a member of the family, for example, an uncle or an elder brother or a grandfather who steps in and takes that role. Indeed, in some cultures, kids have a whole team of fathers, each who which fulfill a different aspect of that child's life. So I just wanted to put that out there so you're aware that when I'm talking about fathers, I'm not just talking exclusively about those involved in conception. So let's start with our first myth, and that is that dads are not instinctive parents, but mothers are. And this is something that I actually hear quite often repeated by the fathers that I study, that they're worried about going forward into fatherhood because their partner will naturally know what to do with the child and they will not. We bust this myth pretty early on, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of science about why we now know that fathers are as biologically primed to parent as their mothers. Indeed, as parents, we all have an instinct to parent based upon our biology. And then, as I'm sure you're all aware, there is a lot to learn for both parents. So first of all, when a man becomes a father for the first time, his testosterone drops and it never returns to pre-birth levels. Indeed, it can drop by about a third. And it's really important that that testosterone level drops for one key reason. Testosterone is a really good hormone if you're looking for a mate. It makes you very aware of what's going on outside the family and you constantly scan the horizon. However, when you become a father for the first time, we need you to shift your attention to your family. And that means that that testosterone has got to go, and it does. Studies have now been carried out in a longitudinal nature around the world, from cultures as diverse as China to Jamaica, Norway to the US, and here in Britain with my own study. And we know that testosterone does drop in fathers when they become fathers for the first time. So it's not a cultural artifact, it's actually something that has been selected for by evolution. And it's important for two reasons. First of all, we know that men with naturally lower testosterone tend to be much more motivated to care for children and much more empathetic in meeting those child's emotional and practical needs. Secondly, testosterone, when it's at high level, blocks the bonding hormones dopamine and oxytocin. And that means that fathers who have high testosterone don't have the same flood of bonding chemicals which are required to start building that bond with your baby. By dropping the testosterone, dopamine and oxytocin have a much greater impact on the father's brain, and it becomes much easier for him to bond with his child. As yet, we're not entirely sure when the testosterone drop actually occurs, whether it's before birth via an interaction with the pregnant partner, or it's after birth once the baby has come into the father's life and they start interacting. And in fact, Lee Gettler, who was one of the first to study longitudinal testosterone drops in Filipino men, is currently undergoing a longitudinal study looking at levels pre-birth to post-birth to try and identify when that point might be. So fathers go through similar hormonal changes to mothers to prime them to be hands-on parents. The second bit of evidence I want to look at is looking at changes in the brain as men become fathers. Now, we've known for some time that women undergo a change in their brain structure, which primes them for parents, which enhances their parenting abilities. And we now know that fathers go through an identical brain change after the baby is born. So this was a study which looked at fathers' brains 2 weeks after birth as compared to 6 weeks after birth, and significant changes were seen. In the first instance, significant changes were seen in the core of the brain, particularly in areas of the brain which are associated with attachment behaviors, nurturing, and risk detection. So those are all key parenting behaviors. And in the outer areas of the brain, the neocortex, the very folded area of the brain, you can see those there, those orange marks on the right-hand side of the screen. And those were particularly in areas of the brain linked to things like empathy, but also linked to planning, problem solving, and attention, which are all key parenting behaviors. It's very important as a new parent that you are able to attend to your child without getting distracted. And it's important that you have those planning skills and those problem learning skills, particularly as you start to learn how to be a parent for the first time. So it's very, very clear that as compared to mothers, fathers are as primed to parent as mothers are. And so when we hear that message that mothers are more instinctive parents, we can now use science to say that no, in fact, both fathers and mothers are instinctively primed to parent by evolution. And it's unsurprising. Evolution doesn't leave things to chance. And therefore, it's important that evolution has given both parents the best chance to do a good job at raising our very dependent children. Another piece of information that shows us that fathers are engaged and indeed attached to their children as strongly as mothers is the concept of biobehavioral synchrony. Now, this is really, for me, fundamentally shows how important love is, and indeed love between a parent and a child. If I explain to you what it is, biobehavioral synchrony occurs when every mechanism in the body between two people in a couple, a dyad, whether it be father and child or mother and child, come into synchrony during interaction. And what we see, I think we're probably all aware of the bodily synchrony that occurs between people when they are very close. We see, mimicking of gestures, of body movements, even of things like language choice and jargon that's used. But if we look inside the body, we also see a similar synchrony in physiology. So when those two people come together, we see a synchrony occurring in terms of their blood pressure, their body temperature, and their heart rate. They tend to come into synchrony. If we look in the brain, we also see synchrony at two levels. We see synchrony in neurochemical release, particularly in oxytocin release. And as we know, oxytocin is a key bonding hormone. Now, we all exist at different levels of baseline levels of oxytocin and the other bonding hormones. But when we are interacting with someone who we are close to, those come into synchrony. Lastly, and most excitingly, I think, is that we see brain activation, neural synchrony. So we see areas of patterns of activation in the brain also come into synchrony. And recently, we've known for some time that this occurs in mother-child dyads, but now recently, in fact, in 2021, a study was published which showed this also occurs in father-child dyads. So we saw synchrony occurring in two key areas of the brain, the orbito or prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is where social cognition is, where reciprocity and trust and attention are. So very important if you're sharing an interaction with somebody, but also in the TPJ, which is associated with mentalizing, which is understanding somebody else's intentions, understanding their emotional state, which is also very important when we're looking at reciprocal behaviors and bonding. And what was even more interesting is that this activity is the strongest, this synchrony activity is the strongest when we have fathers who are very engaged hands-on fathers. So fathers who really identify with the role of being a sensitive and present father. So biobehavioral synchrony for me shows how important the bond between fathers and children is, because evolution has seen fit to engage every mechanism in that father's body and in that child's body to make sure that that dyad is as closely bonded as they possibly can be. Indeed, we could look at it as two separate organisms becoming one in terms of their physiological, behavioral, and neural reactions. So myth number 2 we're moving on to: mums attach to their babies, dads don't. And this is something that I was quite shocked to see was still a belief when I started my studies 15 years ago. I think we can all maybe look at the parents that we've known or dads in the lives, maybe dads of our friends, or indeed for me, my partner, and know that fathers build profound and deep bonds with their children. But however, the idea from the 1950s, first suggested by John Bowlby, that in fact the key attachment relationship was between mother and child, tends to have endured. And it's felt that that bond is much stronger than that between father and child. And studies looking at attachment behaviors luckily have managed to disprove this. What's really interesting about the attachment relationship between father and child and mother and child is they are distinctly different. And this, in fact, underscores the different things that fathers and mothers bring to child development. Now, if those of you are unaware of what an attachment relationship is, it's a deeply profound, very deep and developmentally significant relationship between two individuals. The one between a child and their carers as they grow is fundamentally important in development, particularly in the 0 to 5 year category of age group. But if we look at these two different attachment relationships between mothers and children and fathers and children, we see some distinct differences. So mothers' attachment relationships are very much based upon nurture, whereas fathers' attachment relationships are based upon nurture and the concept of challenge. So it's important to note there that both fathers and mothers have deep nurturing relationships with their children, but we have this added element of challenge with fathers. So if we try and conceive of the mother's attachment, it's quite inward looking. She holds the child to her, she nurtures it, and it's excluding of all other relationships beyond it. Fathers also build this nurturing relationship, but what they do is they use the secure base that nurturing relationship develops between them and their child to turn the child to the world and say, this is the world, and I'm going to challenge you to enter into it and to learn how to survive and thrive. And therefore, fathers very much are involved in actually scaffolding their child's entry into the world beyond the family. Indeed, this difference in attachment behavior is shown in the different ways we assess how a child is attached to their parent, whether it be a secure or insecure attachment. So with mothers, we use the strange situation, which is when the child is confronted with a stranger, and we look at the reaction and in particular the reconciliation behavior between mother and child to understand the nature of the attachment between them. With the father, we have the risky situation. This involves the stranger to assess that nurturing element of the attachment, but we also have the challenge of a set of stairs to understand how the child navigates those stairs and how the bond between the child and the father allows them to do that in a non-risk way. So the attachment between the two is fundamentally different. And when we get to the developmental part of this talk, it'll be very clear why we can then use that difference to actually promote fathers as having a unique role in their child's development. We also see this difference in attachment when we look at brain scans of fathers and mothers when they are interacting with their children. So what we're looking at here are peaks in activation. Now, there is synchrony in brain activation in fathers and mothers, particularly in relation to things like empathizing, emotional understanding. But we also see differences in peak activations. What is causing the peak activation in the brain of the mother as opposed to the father? And when we look at the brain scan for the mother, which is there on the screen on the left-hand side, rather handily and rather dodgily impacted, shown there in pink, we see the key activation is in the amygdala, in the core of the brain. That's where risk detection is and where nurturing it is, the unconscious, very ancient part of the brain. When we look at the peak in activation of fathers on the right-hand side of the screen, highlighted in blue there, we see most of it occurring in the dorsal prefrontal cortex. This is the social cognitive area of the brain, and is very important in things like planning, problem solving, and social cognition, such as empathizing and reciprocity. Now, I want to make it clear here that these are peak activations. It does not mean that we see no activation in the amygdala for fathers and we see no activation in the dorsal prefrontal cortex for mothers. That is not the case. This is peak in activation. But what this is showing us is the difference in the sorts of behaviors that fathers and mothers promote with their children. For the mother, again, it's that very nurturing behavior. For the father, it's that challenge, that social cognitive, that scaffolding the child's entry into the world beyond the family and giving them skills to be resilient in our quite complex and difficult social world. We know that fathers and mothers build their attachments to their children in different ways. It's fair to say mothers have a head start because of the fact that they generally go through childbirth and might go through experience breastfeeding. And all of these are wonderful tidal waves of bonding hormones. Fathers, because they do not go through these intense physiological processes, have to build their bonds by interaction. And this can make it quite tricky for fathers to build bonds in the early days of their baby's life. That's partly because babies are born incredibly dependent. They tend to spend a lot of time asleep, or if breastfeeding, latched on to mum, and there's very little way in for fathers at this early stage. Children also are developmentally quite slow at that point, and it takes a long time for them to begin developmentally possible for them to start carrying out reciprocal interactive behaviors with their parents, such as acknowledging them, such as smiling, such as babbling. And therefore, with fathers, they can experience a delay in bonding. So whilst a lot of fathers explain that they feel a sense of love at the time of their baby's birth, quite often this is associated with an understanding of the genetic relatedness between child and father. All my fathers say there was a profoundly different sense of attachment, of bonding at the 6-month mark, when they've started to have these really wonderful reciprocal relationships where they are identified as two separate personalities coming together and building a relationship. I must say that many fathers find this delay in bonding quite a difficult thing to deal with. Indeed, for some people, it is the precursor to experiencing quite poor mental health as they worry about the relationship developing with their child, particularly if they hold up the relationship between mother and child as a gold standard. And therefore, I think it's really important that we prepare fathers for this, handle their expectations about what it will feel like when the baby is born, that the possibility is there, that they will not feel a rush of profound love, and that it will take some time, but this is entirely normal. And if they can be, to try and be as relaxed as possible about that. It is a normal phenomenon. In terms of building the relationship, as I've said, children need to do it, fathers need to do it during interaction. And in the early stages, as I've said, that's difficult. What we suggest is fathers try and do something with the baby that involves a lot of touch. So, for example, maybe giving a massage before nap time or bath time are really good things that could be ring fenced for dads to do because they're interactive. They involve touch, which we all know is an incredibly important precursor to the release of bonding hormones. So during those early days when baby is not developmentally ready to have a true interaction with the father, those sorts of practices can be really important in helping dad to start bonding. But once 6 months comes and the child has started to babble and interact and recognize individuals and laugh and smile, then the most profound fathering behavior can start, and that is rough and tumble play. Now, rough and tumble play is one of the key behaviors that fathers can use to bond with their children, and it's really helpful because it's incredibly quick. And it's a really ramped up way of releasing bonding hormones. Now, if you think about rough and tumble play, it's very extreme. It's very exaggerated. It tends to involve lots of tickling, lots of jumping, lots of running around, lots of wrestling, lots and lots of laughter, lots of exuberance. And because of this, it releases lots and lots of bonding hormones. So it's a really good time efficient way for fathers, particularly if they are out of the home for most of the time, to create bonds with their children. The second thing that's really important about rough and tumble play is it's developmentally incredibly important, because it starts to teach the child about social relationships, about resilience and about reciprocity, because rough and tumble play is fast. You need to work out what's going to happen. You need to read the other person's mind about what they're going to do next, but also empathize with them in terms of, are they still enjoying this, or is it a little bit too exuberant for them? You have to learn about give and take, and you also have to learn about the physical challenges and risks of rough and tumble play. So by playing with their children in this way, fathers are gently starting to teach those resilience skills, those social skills that are really important in going forward into the world beyond the family. And one of the most marvelous pieces of research has shown that actually children do gravitate towards their fathers as preferred play partners. And the reason for this is that children and their fathers have evolved to each get their peak in oxytocin from playing with each other. So whilst the father does get a release of oxytocin, as does a child when father is caring for the child, doing caretaking or nurturing activities, it's not as high as the release that occurs when a father plays with their child. In contrast to mothers, the peak in oxytocin release occurs during nurturing behaviors, not during play-based behaviors. So children and fathers are naturally evolved to gravitate towards each other to carry out this developmentally incredibly important behavior. So myths number 3, dads play no independent role in child development. Now, what was thought again 15 years ago was the fact that because mothers tended to be the ones that stayed at home, they were the environment of development for their child, and fathers, whilst they could maybe act as a secondary parent in that, they had no unique and independent impact upon their child's behavior. But as I've already said in this talk, what we're now understanding is that dads actually have a unique role in scaffolding their child's entry into the world beyond the family. Regardless of where you look at fathers around the world, this is their fundamental motivation for the behaviors they exhibit. So fathers father in a very different way around the world. And that's often to do with the risks within the environment, with the needs that their child has within that environment. But if you peel it all back, all those differences, you always come back to the idea that the father is scaffolding their child's entry into the world beyond the family. So there are 2 key times in a child's life when fathers are particularly key to development. And that is when they are going through these important transitions where they are stepping away from the family and entering the world as independent beings. The first of these is during preschool. Often going to preschool or nursery is one of the first times a child will have entered an environment which is not family-led, maybe a less benign environment where their behavior is not tolerated quite as much. And they are going to it as an independent being, and they're starting to learn about, oh, I'm sorry about that, get rid of that. And they're starting to learn about having to interact with people in a suitable way. The second time is during adolescence, when we start to see that move in attachment focus from parents to peers. And again, at this point, children are becoming more and more autonomous. They really are developing their independent identity away from their parents. And again, fathers play a very important role in this particular transition into the social world. So if we look at the preschool stage first, there are two key areas where fathers seem to have an impact at this age. The first is in language development, and the second is in executive function. Studies have shown that fathers who are involved and play with their children in the early years have a greater input into their child's language development, particularly their social language development during the preschool years. And this is regardless of social economic status. So all fathers, if they play with their children, if they are invested in their children, if they spend a lot of time in reciprocal behavior with their children and sensitive parenting, they seem to have a bigger impact on that ability of that child to use language at 3 years than mothers do. The second area is executive function. Now, executive function is an area within the cognitive area of the brain. It is incredibly important in social cognition. It allows one to have working memory, and that is the ability to encode things into your working memory, which is easy to access when you're in social situations. Related to attending, so attending during busy social occasions, particularly, for example, in preschool, when one needs to attend to the task in hand, or indeed the task that the teacher is explaining to you, and not be distracted by everybody else around you. And inhibitory control, and that's about inhibiting those less helpful behaviors and learning how to use our responses, our emotional responses, such as anger or frustration or happiness, in an appropriate way within that setting. And executive function is incredibly important for that. But it's very clear that actually fathers have a bigger role in executive function than mothers do. So again, studies that have carried out looking at young children, babies, and the interactions they have with their fathers have shown that fathers who, again, are sensitive, particularly during play, during the early years of their children's life, are scaffolding their child's entry into that preschool world. They're increasing their executive function ability, and they're also increasing their social abilities, their pro-social behaviors, such as helping, sharing, and caring. So these are incredibly important behaviors when we go into preschool. The question is, what is it about fathers that seems to underpin the development of these two key social areas of cognition and behavior? And it's probably because they seem to have a stimulation of development role. Because their activities tend to be very practical, very physical, they seem to stimulate development in their children at these key stages in their life, particularly at preschool age, whereas mothers seem to have less of a role in there. I won't say they don't have no role, but fathers seem to have the peak role at this stage. The second time when fathers seem to have a key role in their child's development is during the teenage years. So again, as I've explained, this is another time when the child is transitioning further away from the family and towards the world as an autonomous being. And one key area that fathers are increasingly being seen to be the key parent is mental health. Indeed, I sort of always say that fathers are a real untapped task force for mental health, particularly in our teenagers. We are undergoing a bit of a crisis in teenage mental health, and it really is the time that we really do support fathers to step up and be involved in nurturing their child's mental health from birth. And what we know is fathers, again, who interact with their children, particularly from birth onwards, have a greater influence on their child's mental health, on their child's mental resilience going forward than mothers do. And in particular, fathers who have strong attachments to their children, who are involved in their life, who are emotionally available to their children, tend to reduce rates or chances of depression in their children. They tend to increase self-esteem in that cohort of children, and they decrease senses of loneliness. And these studies have been done cross-culturally, and they've also, which is really key, been carried out on non-biological fathers. So stepfathers, adoptive fathers, social fathers also have this role in supporting their child's mental health. And what's really interesting is for fathers, the key thing for supporting the mental health is how important that child feels to that father and how interactive and the nature of the interaction the child has with the father. It's really interesting. If you ask a child how they know they're important to their parents, their responses from mothers and fathers are significantly different. So a child knows that they are important to their mother if she provides evidence that she's thinking of them. So, for example, if she buys the cereal they like or sets up the play day that they want to be involved in. However, children understand that they are important to their father, which raises their self-esteem, if their father spends time with them. And this might be because we've been brought up in a culture of time poor interactions for fathers, unfortunately, because they're out at work. And therefore, if a father takes that precious time and spends it with the child, then they are seen as important to that child. But what I want to stress is all the studies show that that interaction doesn't have to be anything special. It doesn't have to be, an exciting and expensive holiday or any particular expensive activity. It can simply be something like washing the car together, walking the dog, cooking the Sunday lunch, because it's about the time and the focus that the father has upon that child on a one-to-one basis. The question is, why do fathers have this particular role in mental health? What is it about their attachment, about how they interact with their children that is important? And again, it's because of the fact that fathers are the primary parent for instilling mental resilience in their children, in helping their children at the start through rough and tumble play to assess risk, to deal with challenge, to pick themselves up, dust themselves off and deal with failure. They are the parent who helps children deal with hurdles. And we know that there is a positive correlation between strong mental resilience and good mental health. And it's because fathers have this particular role in challenging their children based upon their attachment that they seem to be the key parent for mental health. The reason why I wanted to share this science with you, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster through it, I'm sorry about that, but I hope you managed to grab it all, is because I want this information to be empowering. I want it to be empowering for fathers. I want them to understand that they are meant, that they are needed, and that they are unique. And science backs up all of those statements. But I also want to put it out there so that it empowers campaigners and people who support fathers, such as all of you, to use this knowledge in your campaigning work, to share it with governments, to share it with policymakers, to make it very, very clear that fathers are not a secondary parent. They are a co-parent, and they bring something very special and very unique to the parenting table. So evolution has seen fit to furnish fathers with lots of adaptations to enable them to do that. Human fathers are rare. They are one of only 5% of mammals and the only ape who has investing fathers. We are a pretty unique species. And because of that, it shows that they are critical for their child's survival. Evolution does not invest in changes as massive and as rare as investing fathers unless that father is absolutely critical to that child's survival and their success. So evolution has shown fathers that they are meant and they are needed. Secondly, they have the biology to prime them to be hands-on co-parents with mum. They are as biologically primed to parent as mothers are. There are no differences apart from the nature of the hormones involved. Both parents undergo hormonal changes and brain changes, which prime them to be good parents. Dads are different, and that's a really critical thing to look at. Dads are not male mothers. They bring something very unique and very special to the party, either through their differences in attachment or in their differences in which they interact with their children. And the fact that they bring this challenging element to the relationship is really important. The fact that when we look at the brains of mums and dads when they're interacting, we see that difference. Evolution hates redundancy. It is not going to create two parents who have exactly the same role if that's not necessarily. And by having fathers and mothers who have these slightly different roles, by fitting them together, the child gets the full developmental environment. Now, usually at this point, I get the question of what happens in single parent families, or for example, gay or lesbian parenting. What we see there, because the human brain is so amazing, is we see plasticity. We see changes in the primary caretaking parent's brain to ensure that they can fulfill both of those roles. Albeit that role is generally more cognitive because they have to focus on it more than, for example, instinctive. Dads are unique. They bring something very unique to the party, particularly in relation to development, and they are the parent of mental and physical resilience and of pro-social behaviours. They are incredibly diverse. That's what's so amazing about studying fathers around the world, is they come in so many different shapes and sizes. In one sense, fathers are enabled to be more diverse than mothers because they're less tied to the biology of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding. And in fact, it is fathers whose role is the one that responds quickly to changes in the environment. And there's a very close correlation in particular between what a father deems to be the risk in the environment, the greatest risk to their child, whether that be actual survival, whether it be economic survival or social survival, and the input that they then give to that child. And it's a really interesting area looking at that correlation between perceived risk and the nature of fathering that a father will undertake. Fathers are said to be facultative, which means they are very flexible and they're very open to responding to the environment quickly when mum can't, to ensure that child's survival. And I want to bring about change. I really do think that we are at a crossroads in terms of how we perceive fathers and the support that is available to them there. we now have all this knowledge about the importance of fathers and the fact that they are equal parents to mothers. And it's about using this fatherhood to power that change, to power that, use that knowledge to power that change going forward. And I hope that by sharing it with us, you can use it in your work, and that you can use it to try and underpin that change that we're all hoping will be seen in the fatherhood realm. I want to thank you for listening. I hope that wasn't too much of a roller coaster. I'm hoping I can join you afterwards live for a question and answer. Do keep in touch if you're interested in the science or anthropology of fatherhood. I'm on Twitter. I have a website with lots of podcasts, lots of articles. And I've also written a book which summarizes all this. It's a popular science book. Don't worry, it's not a textbook. And it really takes fatherhood from pre-birth up to teenagehood to understand what happens to fathers. It's not a changing a nappy type tip book. It's very much about what happens to dads, what their role is, what their biology is, what they perceive to be their involvement and their identity within their father. So it's full of scientific facts. It's also full of the most wonderful quotes from the fathers I've studied. Again, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.